Good morning, everyone. Certainly it's morning here in Brisbane, wherever you are. Welcome to this short session for 30 minutes on the big HR shifts for the future. Tim Baker's my name, and we're going to spend a short time together just talking about my latest book, but in particular, the 13 HR mindset shifts that are required for now and in the future. Now, you might say, well, how can I possibly predict the future? I think a lot of organisations are actually applying many of these mindset shifts in their organisation already. But my concern is that they're moving too slowly. And I think COVID has really given us the impetus to move things along a little quicker. So I'll share my screen and we'll launch into the presentation. Okay, so first of all, a little bit, bit too far there, a little bit about me. Those of you who don't know, you can see that I'm a keynote speaker, and of course, a lot of those keynote addresses have been done online over the last couple of years, and I'm looking forward to getting back live on stage. I'm also run workshops in a variety of different areas in the leadership space. You can see that I'm an author, and of course I'm going to be referring to one of my books today. And I also play rugby in the Golden Oldies competition here in Brisbane. And that's a bit sad, isn't it? But nevertheless, it's all good fun, and it's really not too serious at my age. So let's get underway and let's have a look at what we're going to be covering today. But the first thing is that I wanted to just touch on here is here we go again, more crystal ball gazing. And that might be an objection that you might have in this presentation. You might be thinking to yourself, well, hang on a minute, how can he predict the future? We've got so many people doing that, and often they're not correct. But I think when you see the mindset shifts, you'll recognize that we're on the way and we're moving in this direction. And I think, as I said earlier, my concern is that organizations aren't moving quick enough. It's not so much that it's difficult to predict. It's fairly easy to predict, I think. It's really a question of whether organizations are gearing up to make the necessary changes that are required for the future. All right, so let's now look at my whole thing's playing up a little bit here. Now, what I have done, what I wanted to do is to talk about three things today, and we've only got a short time together. I wanted to talk about the employee life cycle model. Now, the employee life cycle is not a new concept. The employee life cycle really refers to the various stages that people go through in their employment in organisations. So I'm not taking into account this morning the whole notion of being self-employed, and people often do get an opportunity to do that. But I'm really going to be talking about employees working in organisations. I'm obviously going to touch on the 13 shifts, and I'm really going to touch on them today. Obviously, you can read more about them in my book. And I've got a special offer at the end of the presentation, and we'll go through that with you shortly. All right, so what are the stages of the employee life cycle? Now, the good news is this is 100% predictable and will probably be so for the foreseeable future. So I thought, how can we get a sort of a blueprint for HR to look at these mindset shifts? And I thought, first of all, I think they should be very employee-centric. That's the first important point. So HR has to involve itself in a whole range of matters, as you know. But I think at the end of the day, there needs to be a greater sort of shift towards an employee-centric model. And if we're going down the road of an employee-centric model, then we probably best look at the way employees get processed through an organisation. And these things, of course, aren't going to change. So we've got a recruitment and selection process that goes on at the beginning, of course. Obviously, when there's a vacancy in the organisation has to recruit and then make a decision and select the right candidate for that position. So that's not likely to change. And of course, once they come on board, there's a case of inducting them into the organisation, and the induction process has certainly improved a lot over the last couple of decades. I think many years ago, the induction process was pretty rough and ready. I think organisations now are doing a pretty good job at inducting people into organisations. Now you might say, what's the difference between induction and onboarding? Induction is more procedural. Onboarding is more being able to orientate people around the culture and norms of the organisation. But nevertheless, that process must go on for new employees. And of course, now employees are given training and development opportunities to grow and develop. And those training and development opportunities are certainly much more frequent than they once were, although they're still very centred on the job. They certainly are important, and employees, of course, are expected to grow and develop in role. And of course, the concept of lifelong learning is very, very critical in our world. So the concept of reward and promotion as well. Employees, certainly in medium size and larger businesses, are given the opportunity to be promoted and rewarded. And of course, not everyone wants to climb up the so-called corporate ladder, but people are still given an opportunity to do that. And then, of course, an employee doesn't always, it's very rare these days to see an employee spend their whole career in one organisation. So what they will tend to do is they have an exit interview with HR, and then they depart the organisation. And of course, they move on to another organisation from that point on. And the average employee now is spending less than 2 years in the one organisation. So obviously this employee life cycle is important because it is something that people are going to be exposed to more so in their careers now, as people leave organisations and don't spend their lifetime in one organisation. So what I've done is I've looked at each of these steps and I've said, really, what do we need to do in terms of HR to be able to respond more effectively post-COVID to each of these particular stages in the employee life cycle? So that's ultimately the way I'm looking at it. All right, so what I wanted to do now is to actually look at the actual stages and have a look at what they might look like. So we've got here a model that you can see that over on the left-hand side, you've got different stages, and I've called these starting, developing, rewarding, and parting. So within each of those phases or stages, you'll notice that there are a series of shifts, and I'm looking really at the current and the future shifts. And what I intend to do is to go through each of these very briefly and explain the essence of those shifts. Now, the important thing, as I mentioned earlier, is a lot of organisations are in flux between the current and future states. And as I said earlier, one of the frustrations is that it takes a long time to move from the current to the future shift. We also, I'd also say to you that if you look, just take a glance at the current and the future states, what's very interesting about these shifts is that these are significant shifts, diametrically opposite. So it's not just a casual shift, it's a major shift and a completely different orientation. And so let's begin with the starting phase. So when somebody comes into an organisation, they have to go through a recruitment and selection process. Now that's never going to change because we've got to still have some process to filter out people. Of course, people can be recruited internally or they can be recruited from outside the organisation, but they still need to be exposed to some sort of a process of selection. And I think the traditional way that we select candidates has been on past behaviour. So what we tend to do using behavioural interviewing techniques is that we tend to look at past behaviour, and the assumption is that past behaviour will predict future performance. And so through behavioural interviewing, we ask people for examples of when they've done this or when they've done that. And we give them a score based on, how much evidence there is that their past behaviour would suggest that they can pretty much slot into the new position. Now, that's been around for a long time, and there are still many organisations using that model. Now, I think there's some credit to that, but I think what we've now got to do is start to look at future potential. And the reason I say that is that we're now in a position where we don't know what the future looks like. We can't predict what the organisation is going to look like in, 5, 10 years' time, let alone even 2 years. So to select somebody on the basis of their past performance or their past behaviour really is not necessarily the right way to go, because obviously we don't know what the future is going to look like. So really what we've got to do is change our recruitment and selection processes to look at future potential. Now, there are companies sprouting up all over the place that are looking at future potential. They have, various diagnostics that they can help to give some indication of future potential. So I predict that that's going to continue. And a lot of these instruments are going to be a lot more accurate, and organisations are going to require those. So what we're really looking for, in essence, are people who have a growth mindset, using Carol Dweck's model. We're looking for people who are able to adapt. We're looking for people who are resilient. And these are the characteristics that we're now looking for to make a good selection decision. So I still think we still need to know that people can do the core work, but we also need to know and feel confident that the person is actually got future potential. So a big shift there is to move or shift the selection process from past behaviour to future potential. So that's one shift that's really important. And what that means in practice is that many of the questions that we ask people in interviews have to be targeted at future potential and not just behavioural issues or things that people have done in the past. Now, once people come on board and they sign the contract and they're ready to start, the second shift is to move from onboarding to integration. Now, if you think about our induction processes, they're extremely organisational centric. In other words, what we're trying to do is to fit the person into the organisation. Now, that has stood us, that's been a reasonable approach for a long period of time. But what we really should be doing is we should be integrating. And what I mean by integration is that what does the employee have to offer? What are the employee's strengths? And how can we utilise and harness those? And perhaps the organisation shifts in so that we can accommodate those strengths. So what we're going to do is make the onboarding and induction process far less company-centric and far more focused on individuals, and not just trying to fit square pegs in square holes. We're also now trying to actually adapt people so that we can utilise their great skill sets in the current environment, even though the job description and so forth may not indicate that. The third shift is from on-site to hybrid working. I think it's fair to say that we're now moving into an environment where hybrid working models is now the thing of the future. And in fact, it's here now. Now, I accept that there are some occupations, of course, that can't work off-site. But I think there are a lot of occupations, of course, that do. And I think what we've got to do is gear up for a world where people spend some time in the office and some time working at home. Now, this has been progressing for many, many years. And of course, COVID has accelerated this. And so we've got to start looking at the issues, opportunities, that are available when people are working from home and be able to deal with them effectively. So that's shift number 3. Now, shift number 4, which is not directly related to the starting phase, is that we've got to move away from this them and us employment relationship model and move towards a collaboration model. And I think this has been very, very slow to take hold. Lots of organisations will say that we have a collaborative employment relationship in our organisation if we have to characterise it. But when you scratch the surface, that's not necessarily the case. So I think we've got to move away significantly from this them and us to the collaboration. Now, I talk about how we can do this in the book, so I won't go into great detail here, but nevertheless, that's critically important. Now, that's the starting phase. And then when we move into the developing phase, this is about developing the individual. And of course, the first shift is moving from training to multi-dimensional learning. And unfortunately, and I would say unfortunately, because I think 80% of the training and development that we do in organisations is to really very much focused on a job-centred approach. It's about, giving people the skill set they need to do their current or future job. Now, I'm not suggesting that that's a bad idea, but I think a model that I put together is I think there are 4 dimensions of learning. There's job-centred learning, there's person-centred learning, which we might call personal development. There is problem-centred learning, which is about solving difficult, intractable problems. And there's machine-centred learning, which is, of course, learning to become digitally literate. And I think there are 4 dimensions, and I think, and the new shift has to be to take all 4 of those into account. So, for example, what that means is that our learning development budget really must be, say, 25% on job, 25% on person, 25% on problem, and 25% on machine learning. So that's a big shift that I don't think has taken hold in lots of organisations. Shift number 6 is that we need to move from a job-centred approach to a non-job roles. And I think, the job description, which we can look at it in shift number 7 as well, the job description, we all, there are Dilbert-style jokes about the job description, but what we actually have to consider is that people play multiple roles in the workplace and will continue to do so. But a lot of those roles are not listed on the job description. And so therefore, we probably need to really look at the job description and toss it out. I still believe we've got to have some documentation for people to follow, but I think that documentation is around a role description rather than a job description. Now, that's not semantics. I think the roles that people play in organisations are numerous, and they're all very, very important to the organisation. So we need to really rethink the way we document work. And that's what Shift 8's about as well. I think the way we design jobs is that we look at the organisation as a whole, and then what we do is we chop it up into small bite-sized pieces, and then we have a job specification for each job. And the reason for doing that is very logical. It's to make the organisation efficient and effective. It's to make sure that there isn't duplication, to make sure that things don't fall through the cracks. But the problem with our current job design is that it puts a straitjacket around the job holder. So it means that they can't think outside the square. In fact, they're not encouraged to think outside the square. So what we have to actually promote in the new model is job crafting. And I talk about that fairly extensively in the book as to how you can do that. Now, I'm not suggesting we need to throw out job specification. I think job specification does have a role, but we also need to improve it by allowing people to bring their skill sets to the job and not just, blindly adhering to what's on the job description. Shift number 9 is we need to move from competition to partnership. Now, what am I talking about there? I'm talking about artificial intelligence. There's no doubt, of course, that robotics and artificial intelligence is here to stay, and it's accelerating at a great speed, and it's affecting organisations everywhere. Now, what we need to do, of course, is, and what we have done in the past, is that we have seen human beings as competitors for jobs against AI. So, the old idea that, AI is going to take our jobs and we need to be very wary of AI. Now, that mindset needs to change because it's inevitable that that's happening. So what we need to move towards is a partnership with AI. In other words, we just have to accept that this is an inevitable shift, and we need to be able to think about this as a partnership. And what's happened is that jobs have evolved into super jobs, and that is where individuals work with AI to, produce their jobs. And now we're moving towards super teams. Now, super teams is a concept where the team works in collaboration with AI to get its work done. And I think that if we don't make that shift from competition to partnership, we're probably going to delay our capacity to very much to partner. So that's the developing phase. And then the rewarding phase, I've got 3 shifts there. One, I think that you'd be very familiar with is the technical know-how versus people leadership. We often promote people internally because of their technical skills. And yet those promotions are often leadership roles that require people skills. And we've just got to start to move towards this whole notion that we are promoting people on the basis of their ability to work with and through other people to get the job done. So it means, of course, that a good engineer is not necessarily a good manager of engineers. So what we've got to do is we've got to start thinking about our succession planning and tie it very much to leadership development. Now, that's something that I think everyone's aware of, but I don't think many people, I haven't seen much evidence of that actually, taking off. Shift number 11 is something I feel very passionate about. We've got to shift from appraising employees to developing employees. And I think that the performance review, I found it interesting. What's happening there is that in the past, of course, the performance review is it. And then, of course, there was a phase where people started moving away from the performance review, which I think is a very positive move. Unfortunately, I'm seeing evidence of people moving back to the performance review, which I think is a retrograde step. If managers are having regular meetings with their team members and they're having, coaching conversations around their development, it's likely that that's going to be far more beneficial than it would be to down tools once or twice a year to appraise performance. Now, shift number 12, the carrot and the stick. The carrot and the stick is really a process where we're looking at, getting people to do what we want by using reward and punishment. Organisations have sanctions and rewards in place, which are external. And of course, we need to shift away from that because we do know there is plenty of evidence now in the research, particularly around knowledge workers, that they don't respond very well to the reward and punishment paradigm. And what we've got to try and do is we've got to try and get people to bring themselves to work, their hearts and minds, and we need human spirit in work. I think that the key to that is very much the way we design work. I think the work that we design now is usually dull and boring. There's very little scope for independent judgment in a lot of cases, even in highly skilled areas. And of course, that can't lead to engagement. So we've obviously got to make a clear shift there. I talk about how we do that in my book. Now, the final shift that I want to talk about before we finish up is normally we do the exit interview and we try and learn something, about why the employee is really leaving. And exit interviews now have to give way to building networks. We need to build alumni. We need to continually stay in touch with the people that work for us, because many of those people can come back on short-term contracts and assignments and projects, given the ones, of course, that have demonstrated that they've got a good skill set and a high level of productivity. I mean, not everyone you want to bring back. And of course, I think professional services firms are particularly good at building networks, but I think a lot of places, particularly here in Australia, are very slow to understand the value of staying in touch with their former employees, because it gives a pool of resources available to companies that are very, very real. So I think that we need to make this full shift to building networks and not just, giving someone a morning tea and we have an exit interview at the end and we wave them goodbye and off they go. We never see them again. I think we've got to move towards building networks. So folks, there are the 13 mindset shifts. And what I wanted to do now is just, before we wrap up, is just talk a little bit about each Friday. I have one of these sessions that I run, and this Friday, the next Friday, I beg your pardon, we've got hiring for future potential or past performance. So I'm going to look at this mindset shift, which you might recall is the first one on the list, in a little bit more detail. And I'm going to go through that in, how you might go about that and what you might do, how you can change your recruitment and selection practices to better enable that. And you can see it's at 10 o'clock next Friday. That's Australian Eastern Standard Time. And you can see the link is there, just like today. You just click on that link and it will take you in to register for the session. Now, the other thing I'd say to you before we finish up, I'll just get back the slides if I may. And one of the things I'd like to suggest is whoops, it's going a bit fuzzy at the moment. Here we go. If you would like a copy of my book, you are more than welcome to. You're more than welcome to purchase that. Once I can get it up on the screen, things are going a bit funny here. Here we go. Right. Anyway. Okay. So if you'd like a copy of my book, which will come out in June, I'll just close that down because it's not, for some reason, it's playing up. If you'd like a copy of my new book, The Future of Human Resources, Unlocking Human Potential, if you'd like to pre-order a copy, just send me an email and I'll be happy to send you out a copy. Once it's out in around May, June, and I'll sign it for you and send it out to you. All you've got to do is send me an email, let me know you'd like a copy, I'll put you on the list, I'll send you an invoice, and away we go. So folks, that's it from me. Thank you for the opportunity of working with you today. And I look forward to seeing you next week. And if you'd like a copy, as I said, of my book, then you know what to do. Thanks, everyone. All the best. Have a wonderful weekend. And hopefully we'll catch you next week. Thank you and goodbye.